Welcome to a conversation on Christian nonviolence. My name is Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy. The other participants in this conversation will be Mairead Corrigan, Maguire, 1976 Nobel Prize recipient, and Father George Zabelka, Catholic Chaplin to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Crews in 1945. This conversation we felt was important because this is a seldom discussed topic publicly among Christians. While among Scripture scholars, it is generally, if not universally, agreed that Jesus and his teachings are teachings of nonviolent love. And as Gandhi said, the only people in the world that really don't see Jesus as nonviolent are Christians. So most of the non-Christian world sees Jesus as nonviolent. Yet we Christians, somehow and for some reason, have not seen for a long time Jesus and his teachings as nonviolent, have not talked about Jesus and his teachings as nonviolent, and indeed have not lived according to Jesus' nonviolent teachings. That's the need for this conversation. And so I'd like to begin by asking Mairead, as you grew up in your early childhood, did you have any sense or any inkling, or was there any educational process that acquainted you with the nonviolent Jesus or the nonviolent teachings of Jesus?
Well, I never really knew much about the word nonviolence, and I'd never any teaching about it. I'd heard it, Martin Luther King nonviolence, but essentially I grew up always with the word peace, pray for peace, work for peace. But the whole idea of nonviolence just was quite new to me until I had a personal experience in the early 1970s in Belfast.
And what was that, Mairead, the personal experience?
Well, you know, violence for me has many forms. I mean, you have the terrible violence that we have here in the north of Ireland, of paramilitary violence, and then you have the primary violence of unemployment, bad housing, and then you have state violence. So in my situation where I lived in West Belfast, we experienced the violence of the paramilitaries, but we also experienced the violence upon a community of an army being brought in to try to control the situation, and emergency laws being implemented, and the normal judicial process being completely done away with. So we had soldiers on our streets searching homes. We had people lifted and put into internment, and no justice. And I remember on many occasions watching soldiers stopping young men in my community, my own brother included, putting them in the back of Saracens and taking them off and literally disappearing them because nobody would answer or tell you where they were. And myself several times going to the help of some of these young people when they were being questioned by soldiers, and being roughed up myself by the soldiers. And this to me was a terrible, terrible injustice on a whole community. And I thought, you must do something against this kind of state injustice. You just can't do nothing. And I went to a priest friend and I said to him, Father, is it right to take a gun to try to stand up for justice and against this state violence? Because I was very deeply concerned and had to do something. And he said to me, you must pray about this, Mairead. So I went to church and I sat before the crucifix, and at this stage I was on the brink of turning to violence, and I looked at the crucifix and I just quite clearly came the message from the crucifix, you know, that Jesus said, love one another, thou shalt not kill, do good to those that hate you. And I knew then that that's what the Christian message is all about, that we love our enemy. We go out to make our enemy our friend. And the power of love is the instrument for change, not violence. It's not the way of Jesus. It's not the right way, it's not the truth. So then I had come into nonviolence and I had come into pacifism, but I never came out of the church and said, right, I'm a pacifist, I'm nonviolent, because these were new terms to me. So a few years later, when I met a friend and the peace people started, and we began to talk about nonviolence, and I began to learn more and more this beautiful, beautiful message, the theology, the spirituality, beautiful message of nonviolence. My greatest sadness is that the church is not teaching it. Nobody knows anything about it. And
But
that's
you
a
came
tragedy.
to it. You came to it not through any formal theology, just in front of the cross, struggling with a terrible situation and trying to honestly find out what you as a follower of Jesus should do.
Yes.
It was like an experience, I guess, huh? Right there and then.
I came to it by going into a quiet place and just asking, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? And I mean, that's all. Every Christian must ask, what would Jesus do? And the answer is quite simple. Jesus said, thou shalt not kill. So I think the theologians and all this just war nonsense, they've complicated it for the people. They've complicated it for ordinary people because we think, well, if the church says there's just war, well, maybe there is a just war. And we don't bother to read about it. We accept what the church says because the church knows best. But really, we should go to God ourselves and say, what would Jesus do?
Father Zabelka, we heard how Mairead came to her initial understanding of a possibility that Christ's teachings, the teachings of nonviolent love, and we heard that in the beginning this notion of nonviolence was not part of her education, formal education. What about yourself? How did you begin? How did this thought first enter into your mind? I suppose I should ask, what about your own early years? Was there any thought of it there?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I was very interested to hear Mairead's statement on that she had not had any too much education or knowledge of it. And it's the same, I think, with me, and I think with most people. Our early life is in no way connected with this. From our childhood on, we're kind of trained and educated in the whole violence system that we're living in. So how I came to this, it was a long process, actually, and it took many years. And it started, actually, when, well, I think it started, actually, when I visited Japan in 1945 after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I was on the island, of course, when the bombs dropped, and I saw the men when they came back and so forth. But for them, it was just a target, and they did a beautiful job in that way. But I went an occupation into Japan, and we visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki within 2 months, 3 months after the bomb dropped. And we saw the devastation, but everybody has seen the physical devastation of those cities on TV and different places. But I went around in the periphery of those two cities and visited the centers, the medical centers, where there were still little children, women, old people lying on the pallets, horribly burned, scarred, faces, some of them with their eyes out, burned out. And I think this was the beginning, although it wasn't the total, because I went for years after that trying to forget the war, as many soldiers do. And I think the second phase was during the civil rights days in the United States. I was in an inner city parish in Flint, Michigan, automobile town. People were coming in, the blacks were coming in. And I think most people know about the riots in Detroit, and they were happening in the Flint area too. And I was a great admirer of Martin Luther King, who was nonviolent in all of his actions during this time, despite all of the terrible things that were happening to the blacks, inhuman things, beatings and so forth. And so that was the second phase. And then I think from that I began to kind of to pay more attention to my sermons and the reading of the scriptures and the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus saying very clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies, don't hate them, repay evil with good, do good to those that hate you and persecute you and so forth. And so then from that, I think meditations, I went through, I think, a trial period in which I was really struggling with this, because something had been wrong right from the beginning when I saw those charred remains of those little children. They didn't have anything to do with the war. They had nothing to do with it. There's a worm that squirmed through my stomach for 20, 25, 30 years. And I'd like at this time publicly to thank you, because you came in just at the time that I was struggling with this, and you helped me to really come to this theological understanding of nonviolence the way Jesus taught it, and the background of it and all of that. So I think for 20, 25 years I was still in the military mindset, and then since then, 15 years, I've been totally convinced that Jesus' way of peace is the way that we have to follow if we're going to get peace, because we're in a critical situation in the whole world today with thousands of atomic weapons that are threatening us.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because you and Mairead have two different approaches to it, how you came to it. And I came to it in a third way, which was basically, I was brought up an Irish Catholic in Boston, and we did all the things that are proper for Irish Catholics to do in the 1940s and 50s, and proper and good. Huh?
Yes,
the Mass with the daily Mass and the Rosary with Cardinal Cushing on the radio at 7:15, and benediction on Sunday.
Cardinal Cushing blessed my chalice before I went overseas as a chaplain. Yes.
And of course, you know, that's the whole feeling was all Catholic. We all know what we mean. There was no. I knew one Protestant family in my whole life, the first 18 years, and those folks were known as the Protestants. That's how closed it was, but it was a total Catholic environment. Oh, yes. Nothing particularly bad or particularly good about it. It was just the Catholicism of the day. And of course, there wasn't a thought of nonviolence. Nonviolence was a non-thought. Mm-hmm. In all honesty, the best thing you could be in that world was a priest, mm-hmm. and the second best thing you could be was a Marine.
A Marine, a soldier.
A soldier.
That's right, yeah.
So, everything was like that until I went away to university, mm-hmm. and began to read Scripture for the first time by myself, especially the Gospels and the New Testament. And all of a sudden there was this tremendous dissonance between what I had learned about violence, and kind of the ethos of the community I lived in, and what was on the pages of the Gospel. Mm-hmm. But it was an impossible human situation, because having been born and brought up in that intense Catholic atmosphere, never having heard this, the immediate thought was, this is heresy. Mm-hmm. You know, now you're going on dangerous ground here. You know, you're about to lose your faith. And so it was literally years of living with this and trying to figure this out, and to a large extent trying to ignore it, the discrepancy between what I was brought up with and what was on the pages of the Gospel.
And weren't you at one time thinking of being a Marine either?
I actually joined.
You actually joined?
I actually joined, swore, took the oath, and all that business there. Oh, that was wonderful. Huh? But what happened was, I can't quite get the exact moments, but all of a sudden I came across very, very quickly Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, mm-hmm. and Father John L. Mackenzie, all Catholic, and all three of them from different angles. Dorothy Day from working with the poor, John L. Mackenzie, a biblical scholar of world renown, and of course Thomas Merton was Thomas Merton. Huh?
Well known, yes.
Yeah? And every one of them was saying the same thing, that Christ's teachings were teachings of nonviolent love, and all of a sudden that just broke it open for me, because then I knew it was possible to be Catholic, mm-hmm. and to be this, and so it's three totally different routes, and yet I think, in all honesty, this is not the average pilgrimage of the average Catholic or Christian. They never come across. They never have the experience in front of the cross that you had. the whole series of events that you went through are these. So the question I guess I'd have, Mairead, is this. In your relationship with the church, and by the church I mean, of course, it would have to be primarily Catholic, because that's the community that you belong to, but I also mean the larger church, Orthodox and Protestant, the universal church also. How do you relate as a Catholic, or as a Christian, let's put it that way, how do you relate as a Christian who believes Jesus' teachings of nonviolence to a Christian community that for the most part, maybe 90–95%, rejects that? How do you live with that? How do you work with that?
Well, you see, I wouldn't accept your analysis that 90–95% of the Christian community reject nonviolence. I think, Father, that 95% have never really been, never had the opportunity to learn about nonviolence. I mean, you go into some of the communities here in Belfast, right across the different churches, and even beyond the churches, those who don't profess Christianity, and you have people there who know in their heart it is wrong to kill, who spend a great deal of their time in praying and praying for their enemies, but they don't really have known nonviolence because they've never come into a situation where people have helped to explain it to them. And so what we have got to do, we have got to say to the churches, all of the churches, provide us with ministers who know the theology and spirituality of nonviolence so that they can teach the people who already in their heart are at nonviolence. You see, I really, previous to this experience, knew about love and knew about peace. And in a sense, the experience and meeting somebody later on, like Kieran McKeown, the co-founder of the Peace People, who's committed to non-violence, who helped me read and articulate it more. So that's what we need. We need the churchmen, especially the spiritual leaders, to be able to explain it in a bit more depth. And people, many people will say they're ripe for it. Of course I'm non-violent. I just never really understood it, and it was never explained. So I think we're at a stage where people will make that leap into it if they're helped more.
But you see, just ministers and teachers and so forth, I think that the media also has a real opportunity to bring this idea, which is basic to Christianity, to the fore. It'd be a help to us.
Well, I think it's really a valid point to say that indeed there probably wasn't explicit rejection versus just never hearing. Because I know myself, as I said, nonviolence was a non-thought, you know? On the other hand, you've been a priest for 40, how many years?
43 years.
43 years. And, you know, and we both know, at least in, I think ecumenical etiquette probably requires we talk about the Catholic community since we're Catholic priests, but this would pertain right across the board. We both know that in seminary training, that the teaching of the history of nonviolence is the original and most ancient spiritual tradition in the church. The teaching of the spirituality of it is just for all practical purposes non-existent among the leaders in the preparation for leaders that Mairead was talking about should be responsible for communicating this. So I guess the question would be, why do you think that is?
Well, this is kind of a mystery to me, and I think to most priests and ministers in the seminary. I think they might mention it somewhere in the theology books that there's a system of nonviolent teaching of Jesus Christ, but it's not accented. It's not really put out as an authentic way of living. And why is this? Well, I think it goes back to probably 1700 years to when the church took on the just war theory of St. Augustine and made it kind of a norm in which they followed and have been following up to the present time. I think this is the reason for it. They've accepted the just war theory, which in my mind is certainly not mentioned by or in any way given any credence or text from Holy Scripture. So I think this is something that today all the churches need to really look at, especially in our nuclear age, whether this theory of the just war is able to even be accepted and followed or in any way taken into life. I think this is where I think this is where the beginning, you asked where I thought was the reason in the seminaries. I think they accented that, and that we just accepted that as the normal way of following Christ.
I know where I come from, which is Boston, Massachusetts, there is a marvelous consortium of theology schools where the students can interact and take courses in any one of them, called the Boston Theological Institute. And in the Boston Theological Institute, there are thousands of courses every year, and it's made up of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant theology schools, including Harvard Divinity and Holy Cross Orthodox and St. John's Seminary and Boston University, which is Methodist, and the Anglican Divinity School, Episcopal Divinity School. And year after year after year, for over a decade now, there hasn't been a single course in the history, theology, or spirituality of Christian nonviolence. And that's preparation for leadership in all the churches.
In all the churches.
All the churches. And so it seems like we're in kind of a bind, you know, that if the leaders don't teach because they don't know, and those that teach the leaders don't teach the leaders to teach, it looks like a spiral down. And so I guess the question would be, you came to it, Mairead, in terms of not any formal theology at all. And I think what you say is right, that there's a goodness in the Christian heart that knows it's true, even though it's never had it articulated. Yeah. So I guess in terms of your work, like with the peace people, or your work as just a Christian in your parish or in your diocese or in the church in general, have you thought about maybe any other approaches instead of, you know, totally relying on the canonical Christian leadership to do this?
Well, you see, I think really that it's up to us as individuals to rethink all our ideas, and it's a matter of trying to think in a new way, because obviously the world can't go on the way it's going. So we have to think, how can we live together without killing each other, you know, and to change people's thinking. To me, first, we try to live it out in our own lifestyle, and sort of living non-violently in our own lifestyle is really quite a severe challenge. I mean, I'm not a peaceful person, Father. I am not. I mean, I get up every morning and I just say, like, God, let me not shout at the kids today, and let me be peaceful, you know. So non-violence starts with every day waking up and trying to be a little bit kinder, a little bit more compassionate, and in the home, teaching it in the home with your children, teaching your children to have respect for life, respect for God's even wee creatures. I think you start with your child, teaching your child that something he's doing that he might think is a sport, you know, is actually cruel. Make him conscious that he doesn't think it's cruel, but it actually is cruel, so that that child grows up knowing that he doesn't want to be cruel to God's wee creatures, and that will go, he's not going to be cruel to a human person if he won't do it there, and so he's going to have that respect for all life, the creation, the creatures, each other. And I think too, a very important thing has been lost to us as Christians, because we are all special and made in the image of God. And I remember saying to a cardinal in Latin America, he had a beautiful cathedral and it was not decorated, it was bare. And I said to the cardinal, some of your parish here and your parishioners are very, very rich, Father, and I'm told they give you lots of money to decorate this cathedral. Why won't you decorate it? And he said to me, in the barrios you really have poverty. He said, real poverty. And he said, people are the temples of God. And as long as my people have no food, no houses, not the things that allow people to live fully dignified lives, I will clothe the temples of God, my people. Now, that is important. We are each the temple of God. And if we realise that, then I think we will have a respect for not only our own life, but for each other's lives, irrespective of whether they're what religious denomination or no denomination. It's the sanctity of every single person and the need to work passionately for that person to have the good things in life, but especially for that person to have his right to life. His right to life. It's a question of justice here. You see, I think we get lost in making it a Christianity thing. It's only for the Christians. But I think maybe if we're waiting on the Christians to change this world, we need everybody. And if we come at it from a justice point of view, I have been given life, a gift of life, a beautiful gift of life. We've all been given it. And when we've that right to life, and we respect our own right to life because no one has a right to take it, we will give justice to everyone beside us because they have a right to life and we've no right to take that life. So starting, I think, Father, from your own personal life, I think that's the only way that we can start.
And you mentioned, you know, that this way of thinking has to change. And I recall that Albert Einstein, who I guess he was Jewish, but I don't think he had too much religion of any kind, he came out very clearly on that. He said, with the splitting of the atom, everything has changed but our way of thinking, and so we drift toward horrible catastrophe. Yeah. And I think this is why all people, not just Christians, but we as Christians certainly have a responsibility to the Christian world.
Well, what I see in what you're saying, Mairead, is that we often focus, when we talk violence and nonviolence and Christian violence and non-Christian violence and so forth, we often focus on the terrible thing of the individual with the gun who shoots someone in a robbery, or the person who gets carried away in a family argument and shoots someone, or someone is beaten up and robbed in a street and killed, or whatever. But there's another side to this, which is that institutional or state violence, the legalized violence, the organized violence that keeps people in situations of life where life is constantly being drawn out of them because of the poverty, because of the worlds they have to live in, and the impossible human situations they're forced to deal with because of the poverty. And it's kept in place, not because the people want to live like that or be like that, not because they aren't like any other human being. It's kept in place because there is what we might call the legalized violence of the state that simply uses fear and cruelty in order to keep them in their place. So as I understand what you're saying here now, and you just go on with it, that any kind of commitment to nonviolence is not just a commitment to tell someone who is a mugger you can't use violence. If it's a Christian commitment, it's a commitment to communicate to all Christians, regardless of where they are in society, and beyond the church, to all people. That the teachings of Jesus are, you have got to live your life independent of the use of violence. And that means even if some politicians or some legal organization says you can use it, you cannot crush people with violence regardless of where you are. And without that larger sense of the problem of violence, there's an illusion to it.
And I think we kind of lose that today, or we have lost that. We've gotten the notion that if it's from the government or from authorities, then we can go ahead and do it, and it's legal, it's moral, and everything else. We were sort of brought into that idea, don't you think?
And that's a distinction that Jesus doesn't make between legal and illegal violence, romantic or sordid violence. He rejects all violence, and occupations that deal in violence are simply not open to Christians, like a lot of other occupations that don't follow the teachings of Jesus aren't open to Christians. But the problem is that so often what we miss is, as we focus on the problem, we think of the individual with the revolver, and we miss this whole socially organized, normalized kind of, even baptized in many ways, forms of violence that crush people dreadfully every day.
Yes.
And we say nothing about it.
Well, I think, Father, we should never, ever use violence. It's just not the way. But we also must understand and try to have empathy with those who do take the gun and ask ourselves, why does that man take that gun? Now, when internment was brought in here in the north of Ireland in the early 70s, it was a violent thing for the government to do. They lifted over 300 men out of their beds without any kind of legal process, put them in this makeshift prison. That was violence in the extreme. And I used to go to visit some of the prisoners there through my peace work with the Legion of Mary. And I remember a young man, Paul. I'll never forget Paul, because Paul was in there, and I said to him, now Paul, they're beginning to release the internees, and I hope when you go out you'll not get involved in violence. Paul was about 17, he was from the Falls Road, my own area in Belfast. And I said, I hope, Paul, you wouldn't think to join the IRA and get involved in violence. And Paul's answer will stay with me forever, because he looked me straight in the eye. This is a young man brought up in a Catholic family, his mother a daily mass and communicant, Catholic, very Catholic, and he said to me, Mairead, he said, in the area where I come from, he says, my father never had a job, my grandfather never had a job, I will never have a job. He said, we live in a house that's damped during the winter. He says, my mother struggles to make ends meet. We have no political voice. We can't even have part of our political process. He says, while you go for a job and they ask you what you are you Catholic or a Protestant, he said, these are all violence, he says, and if I can't change that through any other way, I'll take the gun. And I remember coming out and thinking, he said it with such passion, such commitment, and I said to myself, have I that kind of passion and commitment to work for justice, to change these things, to have a society where we have justice? And I had to say to myself, I haven't. I'm a soft peacemaker. I mean, Paul was the violent man, I was very well, thank you. He was the violence, and I was all right. So Paul helped change my life. But do you know what happened to Paul? Paul was released about 3 months later. And he came out, and himself and a young girl driving a car down the Falls Road with a bomb in the back was blown to bits for what he passionately believed in. Now, I would say, you know, I'm glad Paul didn't plant that bomb and blow somebody else to bits. As many as a mother in Belfast has prayed that her son die before he kill anybody. Mm-hmm. I know a Catholic mother who knelt down and said, take my son before he kills anybody. And her son was killed. And she said, thanks be to God. Now that's the kind of faith among a lot of people here. So Paul died, but every time, I think unless we show that passion to work for social justice, then we have no right to point the finger at the Pauls.
Well, we do know that Gandhi talked about that we were supposed to be, and nonviolence required us to have the discipline and the intelligence and the commitment and the zeal that the soldier has. And we know the training they go through in order to execute what they're supposed to execute. But so much of the peace movement and so much of the church, when it involves itself with peace and justice, it's kind of like a bake sale thing. It's you know, it's something that's done when there's time left over after the job and after all the other stuff. And these vicious and cruel and violent structures that are set up all over the world, North, South America, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and so forth, Asia, they're simply not amenable to kind of a meandering, part-time way of approaching this. Nonviolence, if we are at least to use Jesus or Gandhi or St. Francis as a model, Dorothy Day, is a very, very serious commitment with passion. And without it, we're lost. I mean, we're talking nonsense. You know, what we're saying is, we're saying to people who are in dire trouble, humanly, that you are supposed to practice nonviolence, and at the same time, the ones that are saying it aren't doing it themselves. Right. And then when the people don't practice the nonviolence they want, they use violence against them. That's right. And so the whole thing becomes one giant mess, because no one, for the most part, will simply take Jesus' straightforward teachings and follow all the logical implications from them. For example, that if I am for not using violence because I'm a follower of Jesus, then I have to work awfully hard to see to it that those people who are suffering under violence somehow get relief. That's what I use my life for.
I simply
don't.
Justice,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's becoming understood a little bit, that we have to use the same virtues, you might say, that there's required of the military, of obedience to Jesus Christ and his teachings, and willingness to undergo, in fact, that's one of the reasons for the fast, to help people really that have to sacrifice for peace, even give their life for peace and for social justice. And this is the power that I think can change this whole attitude.
You were a chaplain for all those years, Father Zabelka, but in the process of being a chaplain, you saw men in military training going through the most severe kinds of human activity, mentally,
right,
physically, emotionally, in order to prepare to kill other human beings. Huh? You know, not only did they learn how to kick other human beings in the groin and break their face, but how to burn them with flamethrowers and shoot bullets through their heart and all that.
Hand grenades. Yes.
Now, did it ever occur to you that your very presence there, without ever saying a word, simply gave a kind of Christian moral consent to that? Simply said to these fellas that this is all right, this is the way Jesus accepts that? Or whether to you or to the other chaplains? It seems bizarre, in other words, that you literally have hundreds or thousands of men around you, every one of them involved with learning how to be a killer. You're a Catholic priest, you're daily reading the Gospel, you know, where Jesus says, love your enemy, do good, service, and so forth, and somehow the connection isn't made. How did that work with you?
Well, it's just the way you mentioned it. It never seemed to come into our minds as chaplains that we were giving a blessing to these wonderful people. And I think soldiers are very idealistic and very patriotic and so forth, but they don't realize that in actuality the reason they're there is to learn how to kill with a bayonet, with a gun, with a knife, with a whatever, with hand grenades, and with dropping of bombs and so forth. They're paid professional killers. And yet, as you're asking me, no, I did not at that time, even as watching them on the firing range and so forth, and the target, which is kind of in a form of a human being, never, there it was. And they were firing at it. It was just accuracy that was required. They got a medal for accuracy. They got all these things. But now why, I don't know. I think, as I've said many times, I think the soldiers brainwashed into this. Brainwashed into this idea that this is the way it should be. The government permits it. The church doesn't say anything against it. And so we can be a part of the system, as I was a part of the system, and it took me many years to get out. I don't know what we can do about it except to get in and with a strong voice somehow attempt to show all those who are planning to join the military that although that's glorious in many ways, they see strange lands and strange places, but underneath all of that they are paid professional killers. They are taught to kill. And the Marines and the others in the basic training shout, kill, kill, kill. So I think that's something we have to really work hard to change.
I wonder, Mairead, just to use a hypothetical question, if the woman that you mentioned that prayed that her son would die before he killed anyone, now not talking about the woman in particular, but only using that as an example, I wonder would that same woman pray that her son would die before he killed anyone if he had joined the army? In other words, there really gets to be a kind of dichotomy in our minds that if the killing is legal, that is, if the politicians and the parliament approve it, somehow it's all right with God. And if the killing is somehow revolutionary, that's political revolutionary, somehow that's bad, terrible bad, and or if it's just a flare-up in the family where someone kills someone, that's terrible too. But we somehow have found a way of legitimatizing the organized, legalized violence of the state in a way that, indeed, I would imagine that maybe that woman and millions and millions, hundreds of millions of women like her all over the world, in men and so forth and so on, would not think the same kind of prayer if their son went into the army.
Well, you see, you're right, Father, we do differentiate, and in the beginning of the Peace People, when we were up in Derry here in the north of Ireland, we were out talking to some young people at clubs, and this young person came over and he said to me, I don't know whether he was being sort of just trying to make himself look 6 foot tall.
Right.
He said to me, you know, I'm in the IRA. And I said to him, well, you know, Jesus said, "Thou shalt not kill, love your enemy." You're not a Christian? And he said, oh yes, I am a Christian. And he says, after all, there's such a thing as a just war, and the church blesses war, and I'm sure that young boy at that age,
You know, right.
so the church blesses war,
Right.
he says. And anyway, he says, sure, I figured it out, he says. If I get a gun, well, maybe I'll kill 1 policeman, 2 policemen, he says. But what about the Americans, he says, and they're blessing the Americans. And the Americans have all these nuclear bombs, and they're going to blow the world up if they feel like it. And the churches are blessing that too. They're talking about how many that can blow up. So he says, I'm right to go on with this. So you see, that young man kind of hits it on the head. Because what we've done, Father, we have put nationalism and our flags before our common humanity. You know, we can wave a wee flag and make an enemy out of, be it Russia or wherever it be, or be it Protestant or Catholic or the IRA, whatever. But what we've done, instead of seeing the beauty in each and every one of us, we have lost sight of that for this big coloured flag. And also we've put God below the flag. Even the churches do that. The churches are identifying with nationalism first and God some way down the line there. So we've got to reverse the process. I mean, I say, I stand for no flag. You know, flags have destroyed too many people. I mean, my brothers and sisters are around the world. I mean, the kids of Moscow are important to me. The kids dying in Ethiopia, just while we sit in the luxury of here, kids dying of starvation. Like, I mean, when my children grow up, I don't want them to say to me, Mummy, while we kids died of starvation, you did nothing. You know, because that's important. They are our brothers and sisters. We have a responsibility for a wider family. We can't afford to close our doors and say, right, I'm all right now, I'll take care of this little lot and I'm doing all right. We have a wider human family. Terrible, terrible suffering. Terrible, terrible suffering in our world. You see, in the peace movements, we fool ourselves. We say, oh, there's great hope. There's great hope. Everything's happening. We're doing all these wee projects. We are fooling ourselves. There's too many dying in our world, and there's too much cruelty, and we are fooling ourselves. So we have to passionately get out, and everybody do something. Even the smallest person can do something.
Do you think that perhaps we Christians, you talk about the commonality of all of us, do you think that we are really know what we're saying when we say the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, when we say that word our? We're all children of God. We're all brothers and sisters. This is the thing that really has affected me for many years. Do we really mean our, in the sense that everybody is a child of God, and therefore they are my brothers and sisters?
Well, I think it's clear, you know, that what we wind up with is we wind up in a situation where if nationalism, as you say, is the first thing, and God is modified, Jesus is modified by the nationalism, instead of having the nationalism modified by Jesus. If the nationalism is what's on top, then what we perceive is, continuously throughout Christian history, then the enemy of the state becomes the enemy of God. Whereas what the Our Father says, the enemy of the state is a child of God, that the Christian is supposed to love as God loves him or her.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think we insult God because we think he's our God. And we make a wee box and we get him in here, and he's our God or our religion. And, you know, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of love, compassion, the Spirit is bigger than all of us. There are many paths to God. God works in his own mysterious way. He will not be controlled by us. You know, so I think that we must, there are many paths to God. We are all children of God.
Isn't it interesting that the young man would say to you, well, the church teaches a just war, and therefore I can engage in a just revolution. Father Zabelka, when the boys come into the military, you know, I mean, in the United States, because that's what we know, we'll use that for an example. When they come in, and the chaplain's there, and they have all these courses on how to kill and so forth and so on, is there any systematic and orderly way that the chaplaincy, as you know it, simply presents to the, at least to the Catholic boys, the standards of the just war, how they are to be employed, how they are to judge, and if they're not met, an orderly process to get out of the combat situation where the war is unjust and therefore the killing is unjust and therefore murder. In other words, we often use the name just war, but do they actually teach it to the people, the recruits, the 18-year-old kids when they come in?
Well, I don't know what they do now, but 43 years ago when I went to Chaplin School at Harvard in Boston, we had a 2 months or 3 months training there before we were assigned out. And we had all kinds of lectures, all kinds of assignments and so forth. I don't recall ever having a course on the just war, which I think should have been there, and all the requirements, because one of the strict requirements is not killing civilians. And this is what was happening in the bombing of not only Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but Tokyo, and with phosphorus firebombs in Europe, Dresden, and all these other places. No, I don't recall, and I suspect that they don't really have a course on what the just war means, because it's not just the Catholic. I think Protestant, Orthodox, all follow the same system. So I think somehow...
I think you're right. I mean, I have never heard of chaplains in any nation preparing the boys as they come in to use these standards. As a matter of fact, if we're honest about it, that what governments do when they bring people into the military is they try to nurture them into unconditional obedience to commands.
Unconditional obedience to their superior.
That's right, rather than measuring against the church standard. And therefore, when the church allows this to go on, and the chaplaincy says nothing about it, all that can be expected is that it's right.
That's right.
To the 18-year-old.
I think this is the same argument that this young man would have given you, that gave it to you. The same exact argument. The church accepts it, the just war theory, and this is certainly a just revolution, and therefore I can kill.
Mairead, one of the unspoken aspects of violence, and of course one of the unspoken benefits of nonviolence, is the fact that nothing costs so dearly in this world as violence and war, in terms of destruction at all levels, the price in agony, and many, many other things that's paid. Do you often make that point, or do you work with that with people in terms of your work?
Well, I think that we are becoming far more aware now that today young children will die of starvation, and that we have the financial resources to be able to solve these problems of hunger in our world just by transferring military budgets into giving a better life to some of these people, indeed a life. But you know, and here in the north of Ireland we know the cost of war also at a very personal level. I mean, today some young woman will be worried about her husband going out as a policeman, never to see him again. Or some young woman will be worried that maybe her son's getting involved in some organisation, never to see him again. And I think that personal cost of war should make people think again about fantasising and romanticising revolutions and killing. On the 10th of August in 1976, my young sister Anne took her little children out for a walk on a beautiful summer day, and 3 of her little kids were killed in a clash between the IRA and the British Army. Now, when I went to see those little children, Joanne was only 8 and she was lying in the hospital with her baby brother Andrew, 6 weeks old, beside her on a stone slab. And little John, 2.5, was dying. And my sister was expected to die, and I remember the man saying to Jackie, your 3rd child is going to die soon, and we don't think your wife will live. You'll have to make funeral arrangements for all the 3 of them. And I came out from that scene and I said, what war is worth the like of this? Thanks be to God, my sister Anne recovered slightly. She struggled for 4 years to try to live again. But on the 21st of January in 1980, she took her own life, and she died. It took her half an hour to die, Father, half an hour to die painfully. Now, I tell this story because that's the personal cost of war. So we've got to think on a personal, individual level. And if it's only for one person dying, then the cost of war is too high.
It's a profound thought, it seems to me, Mairead, because we often talk in terms of war statistics, hundreds of thousands dying. In fact, everyone dies a miserable death, one person at a time, and one person going through untold agony with each death. It's a horrendous thing that we deceive ourselves about what the reality of it is with posters and propaganda. Certainly Father Zabelka, having been there at the really low point in some very way of this whole process where tens of thousands were killed instantly and hundreds of thousands maimed for life, and children maimed into the future and future generations. You've certainly reflected on the cost of violence to humanity.
Well, I think that this, what Mairead said, is multiplied, but we've got to become conscious of the fact that every one of those people down there that were scarred and burned and with arms and legs and things disabled, every one of those went through in their families. If they were, should I say, lucky enough to survive. If they were lucky enough to survive, although many felt among the survivors that the lucky ones were the ones that were immediately killed. So I think this primarily is the cost of war, and the thing that really I think about quite often is today, with the nuclear weapons that we have, 50,000 and more, not only tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, but millions and millions of people. And then we've got to bring that down to each one of those, as you say, suffers those things in all the countries of the world. Each human being suffers that. And this, I think, is the big cost of war and the possible cost of anything that might happen in the future.
And of course, there's always the cost in terms of omission.
Right.
That when the trillions of dollars a year are spent in war, all the money that is not going into cancer research, multiple sclerosis, the feeding of the one person who dies every 9 seconds from starvation, the misery piled on misery. So kind of like Pope Paul VI said, that the arms race is a totally diabolical trap, because even if the weapons are never used, they've already killed by misapplying funds.
Right. This is one of the terrible things. And that's why we, I think, must start, all of us, and I don't mean just us three, I mean all the people of the world, must really do something for peace, do something to destroy this horrible thing that is threatening all of us.
Our time has come to the end for this conversation on Christian nonviolence with Mairead Maguire. I thank you, Mairead, for coming.
Thank you, Father.
Being here, for your wisdom. And for Father George Zabelka. I thank you, Father George, for not only being here, but for the courage you've displayed over the years in speaking the truth, even though it was against your personal interest. This has been a conversation, as we said in the beginning, on a very, very difficult subject. Difficult because the fact of the matter is, deep in the heart of Christianity, it is known that Jesus and his teachings are teachings of nonviolent love. And deep in the heart of Christianity, it is known by both leadership and by people that there is a terrible, terrible betrayal going on. That country after country, nation after nation, century after century, we have been illicitly, wrongly modifying the teachings of Jesus in order to cater to politicians, in order to pamper to those feelings and that kind of power that Jesus rejected. We know that many, many years ago, Gandhi, when told by an English bishop that indeed Jesus' teachings were teachings of nonviolence, but that his people weren't ready for it. Gandhi said, looking gently into his eyes, "Are you quite sure that it's the people who are not ready? The time has come to be terribly, terribly honest because of the terrible, terrible pain which Christian violence has brought and is bringing into the world. The truth is, Jesus Christ authorized no one to substitute violence for Christic love."